afternoon. My name is Gary Wilson, the chairman of the Finance Committee. Today, we'll be going over the FY21 budget overview for the town of Littleton. It's been a challenging year with the pandemic, and the finance team felt it would be important to meet as a group and go over some of the highlights of our FY21 budget to help answer any questions for those of you that can't attend town meeting, perhaps in person, or might have questions leading up to town meeting that we could hopefully answer during this presentation. I will be sharing the floor with my Vice Chair, Betsy Bowling, and our Finance Director, Cheryl Stella. So we will be going through the slides. Cheryl will be taking over the narration of the slides, and Betsy and I will comment as appropriate throughout the presentation to help hopefully enhance the presentation through our discussion. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Cheryl Stella, and we will get on with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you to the residents of town of Littleton. It's been a pleasure working this year on the fiscal year 2021 budget. We've made a number of changes, which I hope everyone will be excited about as they have a chance to go through, look at their town meeting reports, and hopefully visit the website and look at the new budget report that we have posted there. So just to give high-level budget highlights for the fiscal year 2021, I think the main point that we want to make is that the town continues to be reaffirmed at a AAA rating. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but this is a really important factor that the town should feel really positive about as we move forward, and is the result of a lot of hard work over the past number of years. As we all know, COVID-19 has presented a number of challenges to the town and financially. We had a FY21 budget voted and approved, perhaps a little earlier than in previous fiscal years at the very beginning of February. And then the pandemic hit, and since then we've since had to amend the initial FY21 budget. Some of this money was intended to go to some staffing needs, which we ended up reallocating and ultimately ended up deciding to put more money into our stabilization funds, which are effectively our savings accounts for the town, to help give us some flexibility into the future. At this point, we are not anticipating any cuts in staffing, so any cuts to budgets that we discuss were additions to the operating budget. We still, with that fiscal 2021 budget, are making investments per the Board of Selectmen goals in public safety, as well as addressing some of the recommendations that came up in our audit.
Yeah, Cheryl, I'd like to just kind of comment a little bit on this slide as we get into the presentation. I think it's necessary, to address the direct effect that the pandemic has had on our budget. In some of the meetings that you attended over the last several months and continue to attend at the state level, amongst other municipal finance leaders, discussing some of the predicted challenges over the next several years. So I think Littleton overall is in good standing. When we're talking about not having to cut staff, that's always one of those critical things that we always want to try to avoid. I know as early as, I think 2 days ago, I was watching the news, and the city of Brookline was talking about their budget shortfall coming into the autumn. They were talking about possibly cutting 300 teachers, laying them off. So those are the reality, that's the reality of the situation. Some of the municipalities around Massachusetts and around New England and the country. So those are things that we want to avoid. We don't expect to be hit that hard. I think we've got some fantastic financial policies that were put in place, and we continue to create more policy, and probably we'll have even additional policies created from this pandemic, as we look forward into, the future on what possibly could happen if this pandemic or another situation, emergency, were to happen, and how we could be more prepared perhaps to address it. So Betsy, did you have anything you wanted to add on the highlight slide?
The thing that I always like to highlight beyond all those things is for the AAA too, is that that's not just a pat on the back or a feather in the cap. There's two things. One, in terms of, FINCOM's priority is always the long-term financial health. And that's just reaffirming that we are in good financial position, that the bonds look at us and say we are not a big risk. In fact, they are, give us a high recommendation for borrowing. So that says a lot, and that should assure people that the right things are being done, so that the town is in good financial position. It also has a very constructive positive in that it saves us hundreds of thousands of dollars when we're going out and doing these bonds like we will for the library. So it really is very significant. But it's not a one-shot or a one-time thing. It really is an affirmation of a lot of these things that are done on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Gary and Betsy. And I completely agree with you. And, I think the town of Littleton should feel, even in these uncertain times, good about where we stand financially at this point. So moving ahead, just to give an overview as far as what did change this year with the FY21 budget process. We started a training for department heads back in September, training them on how to use our new financial software, Munis, to enter their budgets, and also about the philosophy change around our budgets. And what I mean by that is that we were trying with this budget to really budget the dollars where the dollars should be budgeted, and try to expend against those accounts where those expenses should lie. In the past, we found that perhaps some of the expenses were being charged against maybe not quite the best accounting line. And in order to build better transparency, better reporting, better analysis, we wanted to be a little more clear and focused as far as where the budgets were. As I mentioned at the beginning of the slideshow, and we'll mention at the end, we have a completely new budget book that is posted online. Thanks to Steve Benuti for all of his help in putting this together. It's quite comprehensive and has a lot of information about the town of Littleton, our finances, and our budgets. So as I mentioned before, as you look at our budgets and you compare FY20 to FY21, a lot of the numbers and the comparisons are going to be not necessarily real increases or decreases, because we ended up moving costs into different budgets, different lines. We created more accounts so that it was a little bit easier to track to see where we're expending and just provide a better level of transparency.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, I think that to comment on this slide a little bit, the new finance chair, I guess you would say, when I took over that position, there were a few changes that I thought might help us be a little bit more efficient regarding reaching out to the departments and creating an environment where we would get ahead of the budget a little bit, so we didn't have as many surprises, and hopefully streamline it. And I think, Cheryl, your ideas when you came on board, you probably had more to do with this than anybody on how we approach the budget cycle and where money belonged. And that isn't something that you just, it wasn't a change in philosophy. It truly is something that you believe follows state policy. And so I think it was very important to get a fresh look at this, and I think you've done a wonderful job setting it up. I think we will start to see a little bit more budget consistency going forward with you, where this year, you're right, we had to shift money from perhaps capital that should be in operational, or operational that should be in capital, things like that. Without expanding on it too much, we'll see a little bit of that in the slides coming forward. But I just wanted to mention that typically, in a typical year, each finance committee member is assigned a different departments. And it's our responsibility to reach out to those department heads and just get an idea of what their budget looks like, some of the big projects that might be coming along, and really kind of resolving any issues and bringing them back to the finance committee before we actually have to put this on paper come February. So we moved everything along into the fall. And this year we did it a little bit differently. In January, we had all of the department heads that wanted to attend would come in. We met several times in January, and they would present their budgets to us over either 15 minutes to a half hour or longer, if that's how long it took, throughout the month of January. And then in February, which the town's probably used to seeing us on our Super Saturday, if you will, where the Board of Selectmen and FINCOM meet, we had an entire day set up. The first half of that day, meeting with our four major departments: the fire, police, DPW, and who am I missing? Leaving somebody out.
School.
In schools, the largest part of our budget. So I think that was very fruitful. We got to really give them plenty of time. Nobody felt rushed. And the second half of that day, we met as a working group, the Board of Selectmen in FINCOM, to really iron out all of these priorities that were presented to us by the different department heads and come up with will it fit the budget of what we have? And if it can't, then we need to really look at the priorities that each department gave us and then prioritize based on, the Board of Selectmen's, some of their vision that they had early in the year in the budget process and what their priorities were. And then using the finance committee to really look at how to make all of this work. So I think it worked really well this year. I think we could even build on it next year to be more efficient. And it gave us time. Who would have known that, coming into this budget cycle, that we were done with our budget before the pandemic hit. So we really were locked in. So we were able to really kind of work with real numbers. And so we were a little bit more prepared, but who would have known at that time that we would even have to be. So I look forward to, kind of building on that in the years ahead.
Thank you, Gary. And like Gary mentioned, we they started this process in January. We were done in February, and then in March the pandemic hit. And as Gary had mentioned previously, started getting on webinars quite early on with the state, local leaders, economists, various other organizations, really trying to wrap our heads around what the impacts might be with this pandemic on the FY21 budget. And so that was the process through about middle of March, and beginning of April is when we really started modeling out what the revenue impacts would be, and then therefore what the budget impacts would be on the expense side. Ultimately, our final recommendation was to cut almost $1 million from the previously approved FY21 budget. And again, those cuts are not cuts to existing FY20 budget, but additions that we had in the FY21 budget, and move some of the funding around so that we are putting more money into our general fund stabilization fund, which will, again, as mentioned before, give us some more flexibility in the future years. Right now, as far as where the town looks, we are looking okay. But I expect that the harder impacts for the town of Littleton and the budget and the revenue will likely be in FY22, 23, and 24. Now, one of the good things about the town of Littleton is that we're not highly dependent on state aid. We do receive state aid, and we certainly accounted for impacts to state aid to the town of Littleton. But that is one of the benefits for the town of Littleton.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. I think this is something that we talk about. I know it looks like just numbers here, but cutting the budget by $1 million does affect both capital and operational. We recognize that there was a need for personnel, and I've mentioned it, and our team has mentioned it in other meetings. Whenever we don't hire somebody that we felt was needed, or the town needed, or department needed, then we still have a shortfall, and people are filling those gaps, and they're working longer hours, and they're doing more work. So there is a cost to that, as we move forward, whether it's personnel being burned out, or whether it's through financial cost to overtime and things like that. And on top of that, we're talking some of the capital things I think we have to look at when we do not, or we're not able to fund a capital item, especially when we're talking minor repair work or things perhaps not repair. That would be considered more of an emergency situation, like we'll see with the police station. But say blacktopping a parking lot, for instance, that's preventative because it's going to extend the life of a parking lot. Not doing things like that, what will that cost us in the future? We'll see. But I think at the end of the day, we were very comfortable with the cuts, but we do realize that it affects a lot of people, and potentially we'll have to keep a more watchful eye going forward on some of these things that we were not able to get done through capital expense.
Thank you, Gary. And as you mentioned, a lot of the cuts or the additions to the FY21 budget were on the town's operating budget side. The town's operating budget had remained level funded and stagnant for quite some time. And initially we thought we were going to be able to resolve some of those issues and concerns that had been raised. But when we needed to cut almost $1 million, unfortunately, some of those needs we weren't able to meet. Just high level, about $500,000 was cut from the town operating budget, and about $100,000 from the school operating budget. And then in totality, we cut about $350,000 in capital requests that were previously approved. As we look at what are available resources for the FY21 budget, this is revenue as well as free cash. So when looking at this, understand that this is both sources. So when we talk about an increase of 2.9 million, as you can see, 2.6 million of that 2.9 is the free cash that we're using for fiscal year 2021, and the majority of that is for capital stabilization and general fund stabilization transfers. As you can see in FY21, our local receipts and state aid are decreasing by about $1.2 million. That being said, we are still meeting our financial policy requirements and ensuring that we are not diverging from them, and we are actually going above and beyond them by putting additional funds into stabilization. Moving ahead, this is a summary of the overall spending plan for the town. About in totality is going up 5.48%. And as you can see, when you're comparing 20 to 21, some things are going down, some things are going up. Employee retiree benefits, which typically goes up more than 2%, is only going up 2%. And the big reason behind that is we have now an HR department in the budget. A large number of costs that sat into that employee and retiree benefits are now in the HR department, as well as a number of items were paid out of that section that are now sitting in different town operating budgets. And so when we talked about shifting of costs and things like that, that's one of the buckets where it had the biggest impact. Next up, I just wanted to highlight some of the changes that you might have seen when you looked at your town meeting warrant and the financial articles. The operating budget article now has every single department listed in it. Previously, some departments were rolled up. So for instance, the finance department was just said finance and budget, salaries and expenses. And what was included in there was the accounting office, the treasurer's office, the collector's office, and the assessing office. And when you look at your warrant now, you'll see all of those now broken out. And the purpose of this was just to, again, provide some additional detail and transparency to you as the residents, as well as clearly putting a distinction on what are the voting lines in the warrant and voting salaries by functional area and expenses by functional area. So just trying to make the operating budget in the warrant book a bit more clear and transparent. The capital article is the same information that's always been presented in the past. The only difference is that it's now a chart, and the goal with that was just to make it a little bit easier to read and easier to digest. Gary, did you have something you'd like to mention?
No, I was just going to mention I looked at it. I received our the town meeting report in the mail, like every resident in Littleton should have by now, and I do like the fact now you can look at it, and anyone that might have a question on what the why is a certain department look out of whack, or why does it have so much money going to that, now you can actually drill down and see where this money's being spent and be like, oh, that makes sense, or maybe it raises another question. But I think the transparency piece is very valuable because it'll help answer some questions perhaps that the average resident doesn't know where their hard-earned tax dollars are going, and now anytime we can drill down further and further into the budget to show that, I think it's important to the residents. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary. So as we drill down into the budget and we look at the lines that town meeting will be voting on, the first one is general government, and these are state reporting categories, how we have to report our budget to the state. Includes a number of different departments. As you can see, if you look in your warrant book, you can see all the departments that are included in the total general government: selectmen, finance, legal, just to name a few. The big change here is that we now have an HR department that's within general government. So as I mentioned before, a number of those costs were previously in the employee benefits section. Now those have rolled up into general government. Another piece that I wanted to mention, which was a change that we made this year generally, but then as the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we felt it important to really increase the Finance Committee Reserve Fund, and so that we have another safety net for us as we move forward into fiscal 2021. So I think it was an overall 125% increase in the Finance Committee Reserve. It's a little over $300,000. And again, that's a safety net for unexpected or emergency expenditures, and goes through the Finance Committee, and they vote and approve those. And then we have two key retirements happening in the Treasurer's office. Our treasurer and our assistant treasurer / HR director are both retiring. So the budget includes costs for their transition.
Yeah, and I think that is significant, and it would have been significant, I think, in a normal operating year. It's even more significant now that we try to have some type of overlap with these individuals, or perhaps being able to have them in some capacity after retirement, hopefully to help a transition, because those are two key positions in town, and it's going to be definitely a challenge to replace that knowledge especially if we're still doing it through, running a government through, a Zoom meeting, so to speak, and not as much on hands work where we can't be with each other. I also think that, as I looked at the Finance Committee Reserve, I think, Betsy might have a little bit more history on the Finance Committee Reserve. It is the biggest that it's been since I've been on the committee, and I am all for it. I think it's going to be very critical as we go into this year that department heads are taking their best guess. Normally on any given year, they would have a much more strategic view of what the year could look like. There's a little bit more fog on this year's look ahead because of the pandemic and what that's going to be. So having that finance reserve and how we utilize that as the departments heads would come to us with a request, like you mentioned, Cheryl, be it an emergency request for something. It could be an emergency hiring type of situation. It's something that needs to be fixed. We can go down the list of many things that it could be used for per our financial policy. And we would have that money to assist each department with, instead of having to wait perhaps till a town meeting to move money. So I think it's very valuable.
Gary, I would just add to that also, it was going to be increased anyway this year because of the change in the budgeting and putting things where they belong, doing the zero-based budgeting, because we might have missed something or get surprised, so it gave us some flexibility to deal with that rather than kind of padding things other places like maybe it happened, was there before. So it was there anyway, and so now this is in addition to the COVID, we put more money in there, and it is important, and it is like you both said, the short-term emergency money. We can vote that in and spend it as opposed to the money that went into stabilization, which still requires appropriations at town meeting to get. So they're both important tools for us, and I really applaud our finance team for suggesting we use those to keep us solid going forward.
Thank you. Moving on to public safety, which is police, fire, dispatch. Big change with the budget here is, again, as we mentioned before, an additional police officer being added, again, falls in line with the selectmen's goals. We do have some additional funding at this point until we have a permanent solution down at the high school to help with traffic flow down there during school time. Additional funds for training. And again, this was another area where we had what I call reconciliation of costs. There were some items that were previously in the capital plan that really are operating budget items. And so they got moved into the operating budget as per the definition in the town of Littleton's financial policies. As well as there was just some other money that was paid out of other lines, again, similar to the employee benefits for training and things like that, that really should have been in the department's budget.
On this, I would just like to add that this is such a critical part to living in Littleton, having a safe community where we don't have to worry about our children or a lot of things that some other communities might have to really consider for safety's sake. I think we take it for granted a little bit, or maybe we don't, as we really struggled with some of the I think where the additional police officer is very necessary. I think the ask originally was probably, I think, for 3, if we look at surrounding towns and our population in the area that we cover. Initial budget, I believe we were going to budget for 2. Is that correct, Cheryl, in February?
That's correct. Yeah,
so I think the selectmen, it was definitely on a few of their goals in September to make sure that we maintained a strong police force and brought them up to up to a staffing level that we needed to effectively keep the town safe. I think the fire department has some needs as well, some capital needs, and also, we some things that we are going to have to look at going forward for, different fire staff. regarding inspections and things like that. So these things aren't going to go away. The town's only going to grow, and we're going to continually need to make sure that these departments are staffed appropriately.
I agree with that. I also, always like to say too, the growth isn't free. And so we have the point, we have things like that, and we get some revenue from those things, but there are costs involved as well. And they take a lot of, as Gary said, to keep everybody safe. Also, all these departments are, it's not like the old days. They are also social service agencies as well. And that's just the expectation and so on of what they do. So their jobs, everybody's jobs have expanded. So this is all very, very important for the whole well-being of the town.
Thank you. Moving on to public works, highway, roadway, transfer station. The town continues to invest in roadway improvements as they have in years past, as well as what's a large part of the increase is for the transfer station and some of the mandates that are coming down from the EPA that we must adhere to. And then again, this is another functional area where there was some items that were previously in capital that did not fit the capital definition and was moved into the operating budget.
Obviously, the cost to move waste, our trash is increasing, and they do a great job trying to, minimize those costs, but they are going up. Things are getting harder to move around, transportation costs. So I think we're probably going to continue to see an increase here, where these budgets will continually have to be increased, as well as looking strategically at new technologies that assist us with some of this. And then we have the PFAS issue that is going to be an ongoing project probably for years to come. The PFAS in our water supply that we're going to it's going to have impact not only for the Littleton Light and Water or Littleton Water Department, but also on the transfer station side. Is that that area is going to probably need some remediation to shore up our old dump site, if you will, for those that have been around a while.
Moving on to Health and Human Services, just a small increase to this budget. This is, Board of Health, Veterans Agent. We now have funding within this budget for the Disability Commission as well. A small increase, like I said, in veterans benefits. And again, this was another area that had not as quite of a significant of reconciliation of costs, but there were some expenses that were charged to a grant that really should have been in the operating budget. So not a big increase here, but continue to invest in our health and human services. As we move on to culture and recreation, we now have funding for a cultural council that is included in this budget, as well as a shade tree committee funding and some increased funding for the historical commission. Another change here again, as we looked at budgets and how we are expending money and out of what sources, we did reduce a little bit of the reliance on the trust fund for the library's books and materials budget. Moving on to what the state calls other costs, which is a culmination of a large number of different types of things like insurance and communication. In FY21, one of the things that was cut because of the COVID cuts for this fiscal year was the facilities director position. So as you'll see, this budget is going down. Even though we do have an increase in our property and liability insurance, which is included in here, between the elimination of the facilities director and some costs that were previously charged here that again should have been in operating budgets, this functional area is going down.
And just to reiterate, we didn't cut facilities director, a person that was here working. It was in the budget to hire one, and we decided not to hire them. So, correct, that was a cut from the previous budget. Which is a position that FinCom feels pretty strongly that we need to have. This probably wasn't the right year to do it at this point. But it is important as our physical plant grows and grows and we keep building new things. We really do need to have that position, but it's just the prudent thing to do is to at least put it off for now.
Thank you, Betsy. And then as we move into education, their budget this year is including level service staffing. They as well, there was two fairly large capital items that really were operating budget items, about $200,000 or so, that moved into their operating budget. And then this year they're doing a partial funding in the operating budget for full day kindergarten. As we talk about employee benefit, retiree expenses, this is, our health insurance, our OPEB, retirement, unemployment, Medicare tax. We did have increases to our health insurance premiums, and OPEB and the pension system are two key areas that we continue to make sure that we fund, and that is one of the areas that is looked highly upon by the rating agencies. So it's important for us to continue to fund this as we can. But when you look at this budget, it looks as though it's not having the level of increases that you would expect. And again, that was because a large number of the costs that were charged against these lines have shifted into the other budgets. As we look at the debt service line, the debt service is going down for this year. That's due to just normal pay downs of debt for the high school construction and a land purchase. And then a large portion of the reason why it went down was a payoff of a short-term borrowing we did for Roadway. It does include our short-term borrowing for the library. We do at this point expect to permanently bond for the library in FY24, but that could change. That is just the plan now. And again, I just want to mention that when we went out for the borrowing for the library, as well as some other borrowing, we had a ratings call. And a lot of that ratings call was focused on the policies. It was focused on our stabilization funds. They spent quite a bit of time asking us about adjustments we made to the budget because of the pandemic, what we were changing, and they looked really favorable upon us because we did make some significant budget changes and as well put some significant money into stabilization. And so, as was mentioned previously, the fact that we are reaffirmed AAA is saving the town hundreds of thousands of dollars historically and going forward. And at the same time that the town of Littleton went out to be re-rated because we were borrowing, other AAA communities did the same. And some of the other AAA communities did not fare so well and were downgraded or had a negative outlook. So that is a huge kudos to what the town has done historically and what they continue to do.
Cheryl, I think you pretty much said everything to say on this. I understand the not only does the AAA rating help us with the borrowing side, but it also makes us highly desirable for lenders to come to us and give us their best rates, almost compete for us to use them for borrowing. So it does have broad effects whenever we need to borrow money for anything. So thank you.
And as you mentioned, Gary, you brought up a good point that I forgot to mention. Aside from the fact that we got an interest rate of less than 2% on our borrowing, we had, I think it was over 7 bidders on our long-term bond, and that is pretty much unheard of. Usually it's only 3 or 4. So to Gary's point, the town of Littleton was quite desirable when we went out to bond, and that benefits the town greatly. So next up, as we talk about capital, and we mentioned before, we're still funding capital. We did make cuts to the initial approved list. We're funding about $1 million in capital expenditures. About $500,000, or about half of it, is for the police station, which we know has repair work that needs to take place, and we expect that likely, hopefully, will be going out to bid sometime around August, September, and selection of the individual in October. So at that point, we'll have a better understanding of what the full cost of the repair is. At this point, we don't know what that is, and we need to put the documents out to bid in order to obtain the full cost, and that's why we need the $500,000 now to get this process started, so that in the fall we'll have a better understanding of the total cost of the police station repair. We are still putting some money aside for an ambulance. $100,000 does not purchase a full ambulance, but there was, the dedication to support that and support putting money away to partially fund that in the future. And the other items are, town hall space needs, continue to work on that project. We have major equipment. There's a truck for the highway department, a patrol vehicle for the police department, and the final stage of the hose replacement.
Yeah, I will say from FINCOM member perspective, this is probably the most difficult part of every year, is going through the capital requests of all the department heads with a limited resource, and a lot more requests than we could possibly fund on any given year. So a lot of difficult decisions get made. So it's just one of those things that every town has to go through it. I think what made this year a little bit more painful, if you will, is whenever you have a major repair that has to take place, as we see in the police station, it really takes up a lot of the capital. So it's just something that we're going to have to think about in the future. Vehicles get a year older. Things start to cost a little bit more for maintenance. So we just have to be prepared every year to really look at these things and keep prioritizing those lists, because it's these requests don't just go away. So
moving along to the other articles in the town meeting warrant that are financially related are the typical articles that you'll see where we transfer from free cash. As we mentioned previously, originally the transfer to the general stabilization fund per the financial policy was going to be $150,000. The decision was made in April to up that by $900,000. So the total amount going into general stabilization is just about $1 million. And again, when we mentioned this to the rating agencies, this is one of the key areas that they've honed in on as a positive for the town. And the other amount that's transferring into out of free cash into the capital stabilization fund is about $1.3 million. Again, this is another area where the rating agencies, while we are expending towards capital and they want to see that balance, they also want to see the balance of putting money aside during this time period to help fund potential future capital in the event that the economy does downturn a bit more and our free cash isn't quite at the same level as it hasn't been in years past. And then there's the typical transfer out of the debt exclusion stabilization fund to help ease the tax impact.
Yeah, if I'm going to say anything about this, it would really be that a lot of this is on our, based on our financial policy. We have minimums set in there on what we would, typically transfer on any given year to these stabilizations. But we've always tried to do more, just like if you're creating a budget at home, saving for that rainy day, or something disastrous happens, we always try to put in a little bit more. Hopefully we never need it. Hopefully we don't need it. But the next few years are going to be challenging. So hopefully, we get through this, and if we have to get into that stabilization type of situation, we need those funds, that we will have access to it and we'll be in strong footing.
We've talked about this quite at length, and I think it's been a common thread throughout the presentation, but I think it's because it is so important. We have been able to retain our AAA bond rating, and again, one of the key criteria that they look at is having good financial policies and also adhering to those financial policies, which the town has been able to do and demonstrate stability to them. And the goal with all of this, as you would expect, would be long-term financial stability. And again, I think this is what's putting the town of Littleton in perhaps a little bit of a better position than other towns around us during this pandemic, is because of this.
I think Betsy once told me that, a policy is not a guideline, and it's only good if we follow it. So I think our town is very good about following the financial policies. I know the board takes it seriously. We're very regimented about where money gets put into, make sure we fund these stabilizations. And I think it can even be stronger. So I just think that it's really has set Littleton up, gives us a little bit of an advantage across the board, not only with borrowing, but like I said, and like you said, Cheryl, with a downturn.
So as we, look forward, going from here, we've talked about the pandemic quite a bit, but one of the areas that has been, fairly hard hit with the pandemic, as you might imagine, is the Parks and Rec and Community Education Department. They have had to cancel a number of their programs, and given that their expenses are supported by their revenue, when they're not bringing in revenue, they still have overhead expenses. So, the pandemic is taking its toll on them, and we are, working to support them and help them get through this. And another area of concern that we'll continue to monitor, not so much of a concern for FY20, but again, as we look FY21 and beyond, is the uncollected taxes due to unemployment, and whether that's going to start being impacted. And if that is, then that impacts the free cash, which again impacts the available funds we have to put into stabilization or to expend on capital items. Combined with, there is the possibility that new growth could hit some historic lows. And again, that impacts our free cash picture going forward. We do continue to have other pressures on the operating budget. We have the new library debt coming on, potential senior center, sewer project, and just a number of other contractual costs, as Gary had mentioned earlier, with solid waste. So these are all areas, as we look forward, that we have to carefully monitor and do our best to make sure that we can continue to provide the same level of service that the town of Littleton expects, and be as smart as we can about your tax dollars moving forward. And the one thing I do want to point out, and we mentioned it at the beginning, the link is here for the new budget report at the end of the presentation. I really do encourage you to go onto the town accountants page and under the annual budget, and even just peruse through the budget report. Like I said, it's quite extensive. It's was started from scratch this year. And again, I can't thank Steve Venuti enough for all of his help throughout this process. I have a great team that I get to work with every day, whether it's, those in the finance office or the town administrator's office, or the finance committee, the board of selectmen, everyone, school committee has been really great to work with and made this process, I don't want to say easy, not because of them, but it just hasn't been easy because we're in the middle of a pandemic. But I think that you as the residents should feel really comfortable and confident in the individuals that you have in the positions you have.
Yeah, I believe this is our last slide. So Betsy, you're silenced right now. So.
Okay, right. So I would just say, I mean, I would like to kind of end on a more positive note, I guess. We had the listing of all the concerns, and it's our job to also always have the eye on the problems that we might anticipate and what could be coming down the road. But we are also in a position, given the Board of Selectmen putting together their priorities and working with FINCOM and so on, so that if things don't play out as negatively as they might, we are also in a position to move forward with some of those priorities as well. And we are financially in a position to do that if it happens. So I think overall, I think the main thing is I think there's a lot of common sense going around here, which sometimes in today's world, there doesn't feel like there's a lot of it, but I do think it is here. And so I hope you feel good about that. But please, any questions, contact any of us and we'll get any answers we can for you.
Thank you, Betsy. At first, I just want to thank, you, Cheryl, Steve, Venuti. I know you've great people to work with. You've been a fantastic addition. We've learned a lot from you, and I think we're going to continue to learn from you. And I think nobody works harder than your team and you. So I really appreciate that. I do. I also want to comment a little bit about some of the things. Look at what Littleton's accomplished. We're talking. I'll talk about Alumni Field, the beautiful facility, a new fire station, which is a fantastic facility. We've got a library it's going to be magnificent, a fantastic place for the community to go. We continue. The town is very generous when it comes to open space and wanting to purchase open space for whatever, for trails, for fields and things like that. And I know there's some more open space on this warrant, I believe, that we have the opportunity to purchase. If not this summer, I think it'll be in the fall, perhaps. Oh. Yeah. So I think we've got a senior center that's right in front of us. I think is going to be a reality sooner than later. We probably will have renovations taking place to increase space for park and rec, town offices, things like that. We still have a top-rated school system. We're a safe community. And we've got some serious commitment to a common revitalization that could really make the town look and feel like a lot of people envisioned that they wanted it to look like in the past. So good things coming forward. We've got to get through this rough time. But I think the leaders in place, the Board of Selectmen, are committed, and the finance team is just going to continue to be conservative, keeping us on the right track. But I thank both of you and for doing this, and I look forward to work with you coming year.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.